Picture this: 129 men, the finest ships of their time, the most experienced crew in the history of polar exploration, 3 years' worth of provisions, and not one of them came home alive. 170 years have passed, and we're still finding their bodies. The last one, just a few years ago. But that's not even the strangest part. The man who won the greatest polar race in history, who got there first, who claimed all the glory, vanished without a trace just a few years later. In midair, without a single clue. And in the Soviet Union, there were cosmonauts who officially never existed. Their photographs were erased, their names struck from the records, as if a person could simply be wiped off a chalkboard like a mistake. Today, 4 stories about vanished explorers, and what actually connects them is more unsettling than any single tragedy on its own. Before we start, let's agree on one thing. When we say disappeared, it doesn't always mean some Hollywood-style mystery or conspiracy. Often it's literal. People went somewhere it was impossible to send a distress signal from, and never came back. Arctic ice, the Antarctic continent, open ocean, outer space. In every one of these places, there's no rescue team around the corner, no phone, no second chance. But in every story we're about to cover, there's a moment that has no simple explanation. A moment when the official record doesn't match what was found later. A moment when living witnesses were telling the truth and weren't believed for decades. A moment when a state decided who deserved to be remembered and who didn't. Let's start with the most famous tragedy in the history of polar exploration. The British Empire, at the height of its power, sent Sir John Franklin to find the Northwest Passage, a sea route through Arctic ice connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. Whoever found it would go down in history. 2 ships, the Erebus and the Terror, both reinforced for ice navigation, both fitted with steam engines, a technological marvel for their time. On board, 129 men, a library of 2,000 books, canned provisions for 3 years, and even a hand organ to entertain the crew through the long polar nights. In the summer of 1845, whalers spotted both ships in Baffin Bay. The captains waved to each other. Everything looked fine. The weather was favorable. The crew was in good spirits. No European ever saw them alive again. Years passed. No news. Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, refused to believe her husband was dead, and for years, funding it herself and pressuring the government, organized one search expedition after another. Over the following decade, more than 30 search missions were launched. This, incidentally, ended up mapping the entire Canadian Arctic in detail, an accidental byproduct of tragedy. What was pieced together over years of searching. Both ships became trapped in ice near King William Island in the autumn of 1846. Franklin died in the summer of 1847. The exact cause is still unknown. The crew held out for nearly 2 more years, locked in ice through endless darkness and temperatures of 40 below, before deciding to abandon the ships and walk toward mainland Canada. On foot, across the Arctic wilderness, hundreds of kilometers of empty tundra, hauling heavy sledges loaded with supplies by men who had already been starving for months. Not one of them survived. The only official written evidence of what happened on the ice is a short note, found decades later on King William Island by a search party. It states, in dry naval language, Franklin's death and the crew's decision to abandon the ships. Not a single word about what actually happened in those final months. No emotion, no explanation. And here's where the story gets genuinely difficult. Back in the 1850s, Scottish explorer John Rae, working for the Hudson's Bay Company, interviewed local Inuit and brought their testimony back to London. The Inuit spoke of encountering groups of exhausted white men walking across the ice, and of finding bodies bearing marks that pointed directly to cannibalism in the final weeks before death. The British press of the time, including an authority as prominent as Charles Dickens, publicly and furiously rejected this testimony. Civilized British gentlemen, officers of the Royal Navy, could not be cannibals, Dickens wrote. This was slander from savages against a civilized man. It took nearly 150 years to prove the Inuit had been telling the truth all along. In the 1990s, forensic anthropologists examined the recovered bones under a microscope and found clear, unambiguous cut marks consistent with butchering a body for food. The British Empire had spent over a century refusing to believe in indigenous people simply because the truth was too unpleasant. The fate of the ships themselves remained a mystery even longer. The Erebus was finally found on the seabed in 2014. The Terror in 2016. Both almost undamaged, hundreds of kilometers from where the crew had supposedly abandoned them. Someone kept sailing these ships onward after the crew should already have died or left them for good. Who exactly, and how many were still alive at that point, we still don't know. Which means the final months of this tragedy remain unexplained even now, in the 21st century, with all our technology. What we know for certain is only this. The official British version, they marched bravely and died of cold and hunger, was an incomplete truth, one that had to be filled in, decades later, by the testimony of people who were initially dismissed simply because of the color of their skin. The second story isn't about a physical disappearance. Here we know exactly where and when the men died. But it's about something else. What an expedition does when it loses the race of its life, and who later decides how that defeat gets remembered. The race to the South Pole. Two teams follow parallel routes almost simultaneously, Britain's Robert Scott and Norway's Roald Amundsen. Their approaches were fundamentally different. Amundsen, an experienced polar traveler, bet everything on dog sleds and a maximally simple, well-planned logistics chain. Scott, with a somewhat colonial disdain for such unworthy methods, bet partly on ponies, partly on motorized sledges, and ultimately on manpower alone once both of those failed. Which meant, quite literally, men hauling heavy sledges by hand across hundreds of kilometers of snow. Amundsen reaches the pole first. A full month earlier, Scott and his party of 5 reach the pole and find a Norwegian flag already there, a camp left behind, and a polite letter from Amundsen asking that the news be passed to the King of Norway, should the Norwegian team fail to return themselves. Imagine that moment. You've spent months walking through the most hostile environment on the planet. Every day, exhaustion, frostbite, hunger, and at the very end of the road, you see, you're second, not first, second forever, in every history book from now on. The journey back proved fatal for the entire group. That season's weather turned out to be unusually brutal even by Antarctic standards. Temperatures far lower than forecast, weeks of continuous blizzards. Exhausted, badly frostbitten, the 5 men began dying one by one. The most famous detail of this tragedy is Captain Lawrence Oates. Frostbite had ravaged his legs so badly that he was physically slowing down the whole group, while the rescue supply depot with food and fuel was still far away. Realizing he'd become a burden that could cost the others their lives, Oates said a line that became legendary in British culture. He said he was just going outside, and might be some time. And he walked out into the blizzard. His body was never found. Scott and the 2 men still alive died in their tent, just 18 kilometers from the depot with life-saving food and fuel. 18 kilometers they couldn't cover because another blizzard pinned them in the tent, unable to move for more than a week. A search party found them 8 months later when the next Antarctic summer arrived. And here lies the real mystery of this story, one still fiercely debated among historians. Found beside the bodies was Scott's diary, written as though the author knew for certain future generations would read it. The tone is elevated, heroic, the words carefully chosen to speak of honor, duty, and sacrifice. The question professional historians have asked for decades: was Scott simply, honestly recording what happened? Or, knowing death was inevitable, did he deliberately write a speech for posterity, polishing away his own mistakes? Because there were plenty of mistakes, rejecting proven dog sleds in favor of unproven new equipment, poorly calculated distances between supply depots, a delayed decision to turn back. The diary's heroic tone transformed a chain of management failures into a legend of noble sacrifice. We'll never know for certain where the truth ends in that diary and the carefully constructed legend begins. But this story is an example of disappearance that isn't physical. It's the disappearance of truth beneath a carefully polished layer of heroic myth, one the victim himself may have written about himself in advance. Now for the irony we mentioned at the start. The man who beat Scott in the greatest polar race in history, who claimed every possible ounce of glory as a pioneer, vanished without a trace less than 20 years later. And almost nobody knows this story. The Italian airship Italia, under the command of Umberto Nobile, crashes during an expedition to the North Pole. Part of the crew survives on the ice and sends out distress signals. One of the largest international rescue operations of its time begins, involving ships and aircraft from several countries. Roald Amundsen, 55 years old by then, and holding a long-standing personal grudge against Nobile from a previous, deeply contentious joint project, agrees without hesitation to join the rescue. He's offered a seat on a French-built seaplane departing Norway to search for survivors. On June 18, 1928, the plane carrying Amundsen and 5 other crew members takes off over the Norwegian Sea. No one ever saw him again. No distress signal. No report of malfunction. The plane simply vanished into the air over the cold northern sea, and no clear trace of a crash was ever found. Months later, fishermen dredged up one of the plane's pontoons off the Norwegian coast, essentially the only physical proof that this flight ever existed at all. No bodies, no fuselage wreckage, nothing. The man who had conquered both poles of the planet, who had sailed the Northwest Passage, the very route Franklin sought and never found, was taken by the sea in a matter of hours during a routine rescue flight, leaving almost nothing behind. The irony is that the Italia crew, whom Amundsen had flown out to rescue, ultimately survived. Most of the survivors were evacuated over the following weeks. The rescuer himself, who had every reason to refuse given his personal dislike of the airship's captain, disappeared forever. The debate continues to this day. Wing icing in severe weather conditions, fog that forced the pilot to fly dangerously low over the water, mechanical failure. No version has ever been confirmed because there's essentially nothing left to investigate. The Norwegian government even mounted an official search operation that found nothing. The man who won the greatest polar race in history dissolved into thin air without a single trace. It's arguably the most literal disappearance of all 4 stories in today's video. Our final story belongs to a completely different era and a completely different kind of disappearance. Not death in the ice or the sea, but disappearing from a state's own official history. The Soviet space program was kept under such tight secrecy that failed launches and dead cosmonauts went unreported for years, sometimes for decades. The public was shown only the victories. One tragic case we know for certain, documented beyond dispute. April 1967. Experienced cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov is flying the new Soyuz 1 spacecraft. Already in orbit, it becomes clear that one solar panel hasn't fully deployed, the craft is responding poorly to controls, and stabilization keeps failing. Ground control fully understands. Re-entry will be extremely dangerous. The flight proceeds anyway. Pressure from party leadership and an approaching anniversary made it politically impossible to cancel the launch in public. During re-entry, the main parachute fails to deploy properly, and the backup tangles in the lines of the main one. Komarov dies on impact at tremendous speed. According to an account that circulated among industry engineers for decades, the final minutes of these ground communications were broadcast openly across the entire control center, and his close friend and mentor, the world's first cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, was reportedly forced to be present in the room at that moment. And here's where a genuine mystery emerges, one that fascinated Western space race researchers for decades. Starting in the early 1960s, Western media spread a theory of so-called lost cosmonauts, that the Soviet Union had sent people into orbit long before Gagarin's official flight in 1961, and that these early flights ended in death, which is why they were never publicly reported. Italian amateur radio operators, the Giudica Cordiglia brothers, claimed for years that their homemade equipment had picked up fragments of radio transmissions from orbit. A faint, fading heartbeat from a cosmonaut losing air in the cabin, and even, they said, a woman's voice screaming in panic about a fire on board. What we know now. After the partial declassification of Soviet archives in the 1990s and 2000s, the vast majority of these sensational recordings have been identified by experts as either outright fabrications or ordinary earthbound signals misinterpreted by amateur equipment. Researchers never found direct documentary evidence of crewed flights before Gagarin. But, and this matters, the declassified archives did confirm something else. Less sensational on the surface, but entirely real. The names of several actual cosmonauts really were methodically erased over the years from official group photographs and newsreels. Not because they died in orbit, but because they were dismissed from the program for one reason or another. And the Soviet propaganda machine preferred that such people appear never to have existed in the history of spaceflight at all. A telling example is Valentin Bondarenko, the youngest member of the first cosmonaut corps. He died during a routine ground training exercise in an oxygen-enriched pressure chamber, just 8 days before Gagarin's historic flight. A spark from an electric hot plate instantly ignited a fire in an enclosed space saturated with pure oxygen. His family was officially informed of his death right away, but the public wasn't told for more than 20 years, not until the 1980s. For 20 years, the name of a real person who died literally on the eve of the Soviet space program's greatest triumph was a state secret. Which means the disappearance here isn't physical, but administrative. It's the disappearance of a person from an entire nation's collective memory, a state that alone decided who deserved to be remembered, and who was simply more convenient to erase. Point 4 stories. Arctic ice, Antarctic snow, cold sea, open space. Completely different geography, different eras, different countries. But what connects them isn't the setting. What connects them is that in every single case, the official version of events didn't match what actually happened. For years, sometimes for centuries. The British refused for over a century to believe Inuit testimony about cannibalism because that truth didn't fit the image of a civilized nation. Scott's diary may have transformed a chain of management failures into a heroic legend of noble sacrifice. The sea took Amundsen so completely, so without trace, that even the simplest account of events remains only a guess. And the Soviet state simply erased inconvenient people from photographs and textbooks, as if erasing a name could cancel out the fact that a person had lived and died. And that's probably the real reason we're so drawn to stories about vanished explorers. It's not just about frozen bodies or sealed archives on their own. It's about how long the truth can stay buried. Under ice, underwater, or simply under a more convenient official version, until someone decides to dig deeper. And people are still digging, right now, while you're watching this video. Remains from the Franklin expedition are still being identified through DNA analysis, literally within the past few years. Soviet archives are still being declassified in small pieces even in this decade. That's the story of 4 vanished explorers. Sometimes disappearance is literally dying in a place with no one left to witness the final moments. And sometimes it's something a state or an entire empire deliberately chose to hide or dress up. If you enjoy digging into stories like this, hit like. It genuinely helps the channel grow. And let me know in the comments. Which other lost expedition or mysterious figure should we investigate next? Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It only gets more interesting from here.